Hey there, viewers. It's one thing to face your past. It's another to have your own child bring it into the light. Today in court, Diddy's daughter broke down and exposed everything she'd been holding in. And after what she revealed, it's clear Diddy's time is up. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Didn't Exist. They say you get used to working in the courthouse after a few months, that the rhythm of it becomes something like background music. Same faces, same slow elevator, same half-dead coffee machine with the same 2 busted buttons. You show up, you clock in, and you try not to listen too hard to what's going on behind those big, thick doors. Most people here know not to ask questions. I learned that lesson early. I've been here for 6 years. Started on a whim after a friend told me they needed someone good with paperwork and people who don't panic around silence. Turns out I'm decent at both. I keep things organized. I don't snoop. I don't talk unless I'm spoken to, which makes me the kind of person they like to have around on days when something strange is coming through the building. Days like today. It was raining hard this morning. The kind of rain that taps on the windows like it's asking to be let inside. Everyone came in soaked, grumbling, hunched over. The docket looked normal at first. A custody dispute, a landlord thing, a sealed juvenile review, some procedural nonsense in courtroom 4. I was just starting to warm up my hands with a coffee cup when I noticed the line. The one that didn't belong. No case number, no party names, just a time, 11:00 a.m., room 6A, and instead of a name there was a string of initials, SGC. No judge assigned, no clerk listed, no bailiff tagged, just a red line under it. That's what caught my eye. I've only seen that kind of red line twice before. It means someone from the upper floors is watching. Not the legal upper floors, the real ones, the ones most people pretend don't exist. I didn't think too much of it until around 10:42, when she walked in. She didn't look like what I expected. Not that I had expectations, really, but you get used to a certain kind of look in here. The lawyers have their too polished shoes. The defendants have their slumped shoulders and old court shirts. Witnesses usually come in either too quiet or too loud, like they're not sure if they want to be heard. But this girl, she was off rhythm. She came in through the side door, no security detail, no companion, no name tag. Just a guard trailing behind her who looked like he'd been briefed not to say a word. She wore this huge olive jacket, looked like it used to belong to someone bigger than her, and jeans that were frayed at the bottom. Shoes scuffed, hair down, damp from the rain, curls clinging to her forehead like she'd walked a long way with no umbrella. But what hit me most was her face. Not that she looked sad, more like she looked out of time, like someone who just stepped out of a place where clocks don't tick. Her eyes kept moving, like she was scanning the room for exits she hadn't used before, and when she saw me, just me, sitting behind the reception glass, she flinched. Not dramatically, just a tight flicker in her shoulders like recognition she didn't want to feel. I asked if she needed help. She didn't answer. She just handed me a sealed envelope already torn at the corner. The kind we only see when something is being filed quietly. No paperclip, no staples, no markings, except a sticker in the top left corner. Level 3, Private Testimony Authorization. I've never been allowed to open one of those before, but this time the tear was big enough that I saw a glimpse, just one line on the page, near the top. It said, "Paternity confirmed. Status concealed by private arrangement. Subject was 6 years old at time of institutional intake." I didn't understand at first. The phrase institutional intake rattled around in my head. It didn't sound like school. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard in this place before. And then, under that line just barely visible before she took it back, were the initials again. S.J. She didn't say a word. The guard with her just nodded at me once, subtle, then led her down the hallway toward room 6A. No briefing, no witness prep, nothing. For the next 10 minutes, I pretended to work, flipping through files I'd already filed, typing half a name and deleting it, but I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the look in her eyes, and about that folder. There was a time, early in my job, when I used to Google people after they left the courthouse, see who they were, what their stories were. It made the job feel less robotic, but I stopped after I realized some people don't have search results. Some people aren't meant to exist online or anywhere. That girl didn't exist in any public record, not under those initials, not under the name she whispered to the clerk when she was checked in quietly 5 minutes later. I know because I checked, even though I wasn't supposed to, even though I told myself I'd never do it again. I typed her name in with shaking fingers. Nothing. No school records, no birth registry, no hospital, not even an obituary to explain why she might be gone. So I sat there, in my gray chair under the flickering light panel, and I waited. At 11:04, the hallway light outside 6A blinked red. That means the room is locked from the inside. Once that happens, no one enters, not even judges who aren't assigned. It also means a testimony has started. 25 minutes later, I saw the girl again. She came out alone this time. No guard, no escort. Just her, holding that jacket tighter around her chest like armor. She looked pale, and something in her eyes had shifted, like whatever she'd held in for years had just come out, shaky and raw. And now she wasn't sure who she was anymore. They directed her to a private room just down from the elevator, one of the ones we use for protected witnesses. It has a thick door and no windows. She sat down on the edge of the couch in there, still shivering. A clerk brought her a cup of tea, which she didn't touch. And then, right before the door closed, I heard her speak, quiet, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to. I have to tell them what he made me watch. She didn't cry when she said it. Her voice didn't even break. But I've never heard anything sound heavier. The door clicked shut, and the building suddenly felt colder. Chapter 2, Room 2B, Never Echoes. They always tell you that objectivity is the key to this kind of work. That empathy is necessary, sure, but only in measured doses. You sit across from the broken, the brutalized, the survivors and the accusers alike, and you listen. You document. You file your observations in neutral tones. You do not cry. You do not react. And above all, you do not let anything they say follow you home. That's the rule. That's the only way to last more than a few years in this job without letting your mind rot out from the inside. But sometimes, someone walks into room 2B and makes the silence feel like it's holding its breath. She gave her name as Cora, no last name. No hesitation in saying it either, like she'd practiced it enough times to make it feel real. I knew right away it wasn't her birth name. The intake file had SJC stamped across the top, redacted past the point of comprehension. Even her date of birth had a footnote. Disputed. See institutional intake logs. That phrase again. The same one I saw in one other case about 4 years ago. Different state, different trauma. Same eerie feeling that whatever you were about to uncover wasn't just personal. It was part of something bigger. Cora was young, but not a child. Early 20s maybe. Her posture was rigid when she walked in, arms crossed so tightly across her chest I wondered if she could even breathe properly. She didn't sit right away, just stood there for a moment in the center of the room, eyes darting around the walls, the ceiling, the vents. She didn't speak until I asked her to. "This is recorded?" she asked, voice flat. "Yes," I said. "It's standard procedure. This is a pre-testimony debriefing. You're not under oath, but you are being assessed for clarity and emotional stability." "Emotional stability?" she repeated. "Right. You want to see if I'm crazy?" I didn't answer that. I've found that silence often draws the truth out faster than confrontation. She finally sat down, jacket sleeves bunched up around her wrists, hands trembling but clenched into fists. Her eyes were dark, ringed with fatigue, but sharp. Observant. The kind of eyes that don't just look. They record. "Start wherever you're comfortable," I said. She nodded, then stared at the table between us for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper, but her words landed like stones. "I don't remember what city it was in. The house, the estate. I wasn't told. I just remember the smell. Chlorine and polished wood. Too clean. It never smelled like food. Never smelled like anyone lived there. Just that sterile, rich people clean kind of air. And the silence, always too quiet, unless the music was on." She told me she grew up inside that estate. No school, no friends, no birthday parties, nothing that tethered her to the outside world. She was raised by staff who rotated every 3 to 4 months. Nannies, housekeepers, private medical professionals, all signed NDAs before they stepped foot on the property. The only people who stayed longer than a season were the 2 men she called the Watchers. They never spoke to her, just stood near the entrances or followed her down hallways like shadows. They wore black shirts and silver pins with no insignia. She says one of them had a tattoo of a sun with 3 dots on his knuckle. She counted the dots every time he brought her meals. "They told me I was being protected," she said, "that my mother had passed and I had a condition that made me fragile, that the world outside would hurt me. I believed them for years, until I got older, until I started noticing things." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Locks. Cameras that turned away when I looked at them. Doors that only opened when someone else touched them. And the parties." This was the first time she looked me in the eye. "I didn't see him until I was 11, she said. "Not really. I heard his voice once, through a wall. He was laughing. I remember thinking it didn't sound like a father should sound. Then one night there was an event. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I'd learned how to get out through the laundry corridor. I crawled under the velvet curtain behind the ballroom. That's where I saw him." She paused then, as if remembering the weight of it. There were people in masks, music playing too loud, too slow, a red light that made everything look like it was underwater. I didn't understand what I was seeing, not then, but I saw him, sitting in a high-backed chair, surrounded by people who didn't act like people. She told me there was a mirror on the wall across from her hiding place. She could see everything reflected in it. But more than that, she could see herself, small, hidden, terrified. And then something happened she couldn't explain. The mirror started to shake, she said. Not the glass, the reflection, like it didn't want to hold what it was showing. I remember thinking it looked like it was breathing. This is the moment when I knew something was wrong. Not with her, with everything else, because I'd heard something similar before. Years ago, in a different case, the words weren't exact, but the imagery was the same. A child watching from behind a one-way mirror, red lighting, music that didn't stop, people moving like they weren't moving on their own. A night that changed everything. But in none of those other reports did anyone mention a daughter, not once. "What happened next?" I asked, voice tight in my throat. She looked down again. He stood up, came toward the mirror. I thought he was looking at me, but he wasn't. He was looking at himself. And then he said something, just one sentence. She didn't repeat it, just shook her head. I don't want to say it out loud. I didn't press. I could tell she was nearing the edge of what she could give me, so I changed course. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you coming forward after all this time?" She didn't answer right away, just reached into her pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was folded 3 times, edges worn, corners torn. She held it carefully, then slid it across the table to me. It was dim and grainy, taken from a low angle. It showed a group of people in semi-formal attire, blurred and laughing under red-tinted lights. In the background, behind a thick velvet curtain, a small figure crouched, barely visible. A child, hugging her knees to her chest, face partially turned, but unmistakable. "That's me," she said. That's the night it started. I looked back up at her, trying to steady my hands. She was staring at the wall again, the one with the air vent. "He never let me speak," she said, "but I think someone finally wants me to." And in that moment I understood that this wasn't just another file, this wasn't just another case to write up and seal. This was the thread that could unravel something so tightly wound it had suffocated generations. The room felt colder now, and the silence, it never echoed. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Red Apron. The rain hadn't let up in 2 days, not in this part of the state, and the road leading to the little house was half swallowed by mud. The court-appointed investigator parked a quarter-mile down and walked the rest of the way on foot, boots dragging through soft ground, soaked cuffs clinging to her ankles. She hated visits like these, the ones where the people who could say the most had already spent decades convincing themselves they'd seen nothing. But the girl's testimony had shifted something in the case. Old names were being dredged up, old properties cross-referenced, and one of those names had been flagged in the estate's original housekeeping contracts, an unremarkable listing, logged under a cleaning service subcontractor, last active 2 decades ago. One line had stood out: Red Apron rotation, December 2006, June 2009. The front door opened before she even knocked. A woman stood in the threshold, thin frame wrapped in a shawl the color of dried blood. Her hair was tied back in a taut bun, and her eyes were the kind that didn't blink unless they had to. She looked the investigator up and down, not with suspicion, but with a kind of tired recognition, like she'd been expecting this conversation for years, but had hoped she'd never have to live through it. "You're here about the girl," the woman said before a single question could be asked. The investigator gave a slow nod. "Only if you're willing." "Not on record," the woman replied immediately. "I won't sign anything, I won't speak in court. But I'll tell you what I remember. That's all I have left anyway." The house was modest, painfully so. It smelled of old books and stale sugar, like the kind of place where someone still kept tea in glass jars labeled with faded marker. There was a photograph above the mantel with the faces turned down, frames facing the wall. The investigator followed her into a small sitting room where a tray of untouched biscuits sat under a paper napkin. The woman didn't offer any. She just sat in the corner chair and rested her hands in her lap. "I was there when she first arrived," she said. "They told us she was his niece. Some tragedy had happened. I don't know what exactly. Something about a custody arrangement. All we were told was that she was to be treated with care but also distance. No touching, no casual conversation, and absolutely no questions." The investigator took careful notes, her pen barely scratching the surface of the paper. "They had protocols," the woman continued, color-coded ones. "Most staff didn't question it. We were used to systems. Big estates always have their own little rules. But this one felt different. If you were wearing the green apron, you were allowed to escort her, only to the east wing, nowhere else. If you had the red apron," she paused, her hands tightening. "Red meant don't speak, don't look. If she was in the room, you faced the wall, and if you broke that rule, you were gone by morning." "Did you ever speak to her?" the investigator asked. "Not directly, but I heard her. Once, through the vents." She grew quiet for a moment, eyes drifting toward the corner of the room as if trying to peer back into something she'd buried too deep. "She used to hum, low and steady, always the same tune. I never heard the full melody, but it had this sadness to it, like a song that didn't want to be remembered. And sometimes I'd hear her whispering, not to herself, not like a child playing pretend. No, this was different. She'd whisper to someone, like she was answering questions I couldn't hear." The investigator leaned forward. "Do you remember what she said?" The woman closed her eyes. "Just once, I caught a full sentence. I was dusting one of the side halls. The vents carried sound better there. She said, 'He said he'll come through it next time.' She opened her eyes again. It chilled me. Because the way she said it wasn't scared. It was like she believed it. Like she'd been told that enough times to stop doubting it. "Do you know who she meant by he?" the investigator asked. The old woman didn't answer right away. She pulled something from the side table. A napkin, folded twice, covered in small scribbles. She laid it on the table between them. There it was, drawn over and over. A sun with a ring of hands around it. Not precise, not symmetrical, but the pattern was unmistakable. "I don't know what it means," she said, "but I started drawing it after I left. Every time I woke up from those dreams, same dream, same house, same hallway. He walks past me, he's smiling, but his eyes, they aren't human." The room grew quiet. "Tell me about the rooms below," the investigator said gently. The woman blinked, her gaze sharpening again. "They called them storage rooms. That's what they told us, but we weren't allowed to go near them. Cleaning staff only did the top floors and the guest wing. The basement was handled by contracted crews. That's all we were told." She took a deep breath, fingers twisting in her lap. "There was one room, though. I saw it by accident. I was sent to retrieve some linens from the lower level one night when the usual assistant was out sick. I took a wrong turn and ended up at a locked door with mirrored panels, 6 of them. The hallway lights were dim, but I could see my reflection in every direction, and for a second I thought I saw a second version of myself blink when I didn't." She shook her head. "Probably just tired. That place made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone." "Why did you leave?" the investigator asked, voice quieter now. The old woman hesitated, then reached into her knitting basket and pulled out a smaller napkin. Older, yellowed at the edges, the ink faded. "I found this the night I quit," she said. "It was under her pillow when I was changing the sheets. Not sure why I looked. I never snooped. But that night, something told me to check. It was a note, written in tiny, cramped handwriting. It said, 'Don't listen to the mirror, he's in the wall now.'" The silence in the room thickened. "Did you report it?" the investigator asked, almost knowing the answer. "To who?" the woman replied. "He owned the place, he owned the people in it, and by then I already knew some things aren't meant to be solved, just escaped." The investigator sat back, the symbol burning in her mind. As she stood to leave, she glanced at the tray of biscuits again, still untouched. The woman noticed and gave a small, tired smile. "Some things just sit there," she said, "even when they shouldn't." The investigator slipped the napkin with the symbol into her folder. Outside, the rain had lightened, but the clouds still hung low and swollen. And behind her, through the window, the old woman began drawing again. Same symbol, same slow motion of the pen. A sun surrounded by a ring of reaching hands. Chapter 4. The first question she wasn't allowed to answer. Most people think being a courtroom stenographer means sitting in a corner and typing, invisible to the drama. And most days, they're right. Names get mispronounced, lawyers interrupt each other, witnesses cry. The click of my keys becomes background noise, forgotten until the record is requested. But sealed hearings are different, especially ones like this, especially when I'm told I won't be allowed to leave the building for 6 hours after it ends, and that the transcript will never be attached to a public case number. That's when you know the air in the room is going to change something. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning. The kind of cold that doesn't come from bad insulation, but from deliberation. The kind that seeps out of the walls when the building knows something important is about to happen. Room 4C had been cleared the night before, security swept twice. I arrived early and watched the empty chair at the center of the witness stand, like it already had a story to tell. The judge hadn't taken her bench yet, but the girl was already there. Seated in the far corner, near the exit door reserved for protected witnesses. She was wearing the same oversized coat I'd seen her in on the security feed. Olive green, padded, swallowing her frame like a shell she wasn't planning to take off. Her hair was different, combed back and pinned, but her face still looked younger than her years. She didn't glance at anyone, just stared straight ahead like she was waiting for someone to try and stop her. Then Diddy walked in. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him either, but the air between them shifted. I've seen that tension before, when victims come face to face with those who bent their lives in impossible shapes. Sometimes they scream, sometimes they crumble. This girl did neither. She simply blinked, once, slow, and adjusted her seat. Her back stayed straight. Her hands were folded in her lap, and Diddy, he sat down like this was just another meeting he had to endure before heading back to wherever power goes to pretend it's still safe. The judge entered and wasted no time. "This hearing is now in session under sealed jurisdiction," she said. "Let the record reflect that the witness will be testifying under the court-assigned pseudonym, Cora. All other identifying information is to remain confidential and redacted from all transcripts and internal notes. No questions regarding surname, legal guardianship, or institutional history will be permitted." I typed all of it, each word clean and sharp, every click a boundary. The prosecutor stood first. She didn't announce her name, just approached the podium and nodded once toward the witness. "Cora, can you confirm your date of birth?" "July 7th, the girl said, her voice trembling on the last syllable. "Year?" There was a pause. 1999, she answered, barely louder than a whisper. The prosecutor moved quickly. "How long were you a resident of the property located at 1147 Whitcomb Hill?" "From age 6 to age 16. "Were you aware of the property's ownership?" "I was told it belonged to my uncle." "And who was your uncle, Cora?" Another pause. "John Combs?" No one reacted. The silence held its breath. The judge didn't interrupt. The questioning went on. She described the layout of the house, the hallways she wasn't allowed in, the rooms with automatic locks, the schedules. Morning inspections, evening silences. She was never addressed by name, only as the girl, or once Asset B. I watched the clerk beside me twitch when she said that. Even he wasn't ready for that level of dehumanization. "Do you recall your first direct interaction with Mr. Combs?" the prosecutor asked. She nodded. "I was 11. "Where did it occur?" "Downstairs, during one of the Red events." A hush swept the courtroom, though no one made a sound. "Cora," the judge interjected gently, "can you define a Red event for the record?" The girl's voice cracked. She took a shaky breath and said, "That's what they called the parties. Not all of them, just the ones where the girls wore lipstick." Red lipstick. It meant you were picked. "Picked for what?" the prosecutor asked. She didn't answer right away, just stared down at her hands. "To perform," she finally said. "In what way?" "They'd bring you into the room, the one with the mirrors. You had to stand still while the music played. Sometimes they filmed, sometimes they didn't. You were told it was a performance, that nothing would happen if you did what you were told. But there were other rooms. The crawl spaces led to them. I used to pretend to sleep in them just to feel safe. I was typing so fast my fingers blurred, not because of pace, but because I needed to document this exactly. No error, no paraphrasing. Every word mattered." She went on to talk about the tapes, unlabeled, stacked on a shelf in a locked cabinet in what she called the soundproof room. She said she only watched one, just a few seconds, enough to know she was never supposed to, enough to recognize her own reflection in a mirror behind the camera. "They told me if I watched them again I'd forget who I was," she said. The prosecutor lowered her head. "Did you ever try to report this to anyone?" "Yes. When I was 17, I saw a counselor through a charity program. I told her what I remembered. She took notes. The next day, I was taken to a facility. They said I had dissociative identity disorder. I didn't. They used a fake name. The nurse called me Amelia. That's not my name. Where was this facility? I don't know. They sedated me during transport. The judge leaned forward, pressing her fingers together. Counselor, please prepare that portion of the record for sealed cross-record with institutional logs. And that's when it happened. The shift. The moment where the courtroom stopped being a container and became something else entirely. The prosecutor asked her one final question. Do you know the name of the man who brought you the paper to burn? She didn't answer. Cora, the prosecutor prompted. Still nothing, just a flicker in her eyes, something registering, something behind her that I couldn't see. Who gave you the paper? The prosecutor asked again. Cora opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hands twitched, her breathing hitched. She looked toward the judge then, and I swear something about her changed. Like she just remembered something she hadn't let herself remember until that very second. The judge stood. That's enough for now, she said sharply. Sidebar, all parties. Everyone froze. The attorneys approached the bench. The judge whispered something, then gestured toward the clerk to step out and retrieve someone from the back hallway. A federal liaison entered, face unreadable, and handed over a folder. I was still typing, but every click of the keys felt louder now, slower, like they were echoing. The judge flipped through the folder, eyes moving fast. Then she looked back at the room, her voice tight but firm. We'll need to escalate this to federal review. The alias on this document matches a protected witness in another open case. The courtroom was silent, but I could feel the noise beneath it. Ready to rise. Chapter 5. The Ledger with No Names. I was used to complicated accounts. That's what I did. I picked through the marrow of corporate shells and polished ledgers, looking for bones that didn't belong. For most people, it's a sea of numbers, numb, dull, forgettable. But to me, numbers talk. They stutter, they hesitate, they get nervous when they're trying to hide something. And when they do, I listen. I'd been contracted off record for this one, which told me more than any briefing ever could. No badge, no official letterhead, just a quiet request and a digital key passed to me through a system I wasn't supposed to know existed. The files arrived in parts, encrypted, staggered, and deliberately mislabeled, but someone had already laid the trail. They just needed someone like me to follow it cleanly without leaving footprints. The package contained a series of banking logs, private transfers, offshore ledgers, and payroll stubs. But the piece that mattered most came with a single note scribbled at the top. Daughter's memory, post-event cash movement. I remembered reading the testimony excerpt, a sentence in her debrief that caught someone's attention. There was always a man who brought envelopes after the parties. He called them favors, never said what was in them, just that they were for the guests. That single recollection opened the door, a forensic link between anecdote and transaction. I started with the obvious, shell companies. There were dozens, most of them dead ends, dissolved after 2 or 3 transfers, but one stood out, CBI Global Ventures, LLC. On the surface, it was clean, registered to a P.O. box in the Virgin Islands, listed as an event management consultancy. But once I followed the secondary transfers, the anomalies started stacking up. Payments flowed from CBI to 5 recurring locations, untraceable at first glance, but not for long. 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in New Orleans, 1 in Prague, and 1 marked only with a set of coordinates I had to cross-reference with an archive zoning map. That one led to a non-residential warehouse in upstate New York. No business license, no occupancy registration, just a concrete box behind a chain-link gate. Each of these locations had regular payments attached. Not payroll, not rent, but consistent, mid-level expenses. Cleaning services, electrical refits, private transport contractors. More importantly, every spike in funding matched a significant moment in the legal timeline. Civil suits that vanished, accusations that never reached court, NDAs filed, then retracted. Every payout occurred 3 to 5 days after one of these dates, like clockwork. Then came the line items, internal codes labeled BPR, BPM, and one particularly curious tag, School Project B. I paused when I saw that, School Project B. It didn't belong with the others. For one thing, it was filed monthly. For another, it had no attached vendor, no invoice, no itemized breakdown, just a flat maintenance payment, always on the 7th. Quiet, mechanical, buried beneath layers of legitimate activity. But it didn't take long before the file decrypted further and gave me what I needed. A name, or rather, an alias. The payment was linked to an internal memo, something never meant to leave the system. Maintain operational discretion. SPP will continue under alternative housing until relocation approved. Use alias Amelia G ____ on all medical and educational records. That was the same name the girl said they used on her during hospitalization. Amelia, a name she'd never given herself, a name someone else had wrapped around her like plastic. I dug deeper. There were other entries. Terse, fragmented. Amelia, transition pending. Amelia, media conflict avoided. Amelia, transfer post-clearance. And then finally, a chilling phrase on a ledger dated 2 years after her last recorded payment. Transfer complete. Subject integrated. No context, no recipient, no explanation. I stared at that phrase longer than I care to admit. It sat there like a final nail in a box no one wanted opened. What did integrated mean? Integrated into what? It wasn't language you used for a person. It was something you said about a system, a protocol, a plan that had moved beyond experimentation. I printed that page, highlighted the line, attached it to the growing archive of flags I'd been tagging for review. Then came the locked account. It had been grayed out on every ledger until that point. No entry logs, no export history, just a single line with a faded watermark. Vault access level 4. I'd seen these before. Not often, but enough to know they weren't built for everyday laundering. These accounts were vaults in the truest sense, not for cash, for information, video, audio, metadata. Records that couldn't be tied to names or faces unless someone cracked the key. It was locked tight, but whoever had archived it left a hint. Password recovery prompt. Her name when she was mine. I'd read it again, then. This wasn't an account left behind by accident. It was left behind because someone believed no one would ever figure out the key, because it required knowledge that wasn't on file. It required something intimate, personal, a name that had once belonged to a girl who didn't even exist in the world's eyes. But someone had claimed her, possessed her, branded her in a way that turned her identity into a private key. Her name when she was mine. My hands trembled slightly as I minimized the screen. My job wasn't to guess passwords. My job was to flag what shouldn't exist and explain why it did. In this account, it wasn't just irregular. It was a confession, waiting for the right voice to unlock it. Chapter 6. The Red Journal. The journal was smaller than I expected, roughly the size of a paperback, bound in worn red leather that looked too old for someone that young to have carried for so long. The spine was cracked, the edges curled inward, like it had spent years beneath a mattress or hidden inside a wall. It smelled faintly of ash and something sweeter, maybe cologne, maybe decay. I held it in my gloved hands and turned it over twice before opening it. It had been cataloged as part of the daughter's submitted evidence. No official name listed on the cover, no title, no author. Just one item among a box of effects she'd turned in after her testimony. According to the chain of custody log, she claimed the journal was given to her when she was 15 by a woman who used to work the lights. No name attached to that either. The note attached to the file said the woman had vanished sometime around 2017. No forwarding address, no tax filing since. The first few pages were what you'd expect from a teenage girl. Slanted handwriting, inconsistent ink colors, little hearts in the margins. But something was wrong. The entries didn't read like memories. They read like logs, like something a person might write down not because they wanted to, but because they were told to keep track. Almost every page ended with a sequence of numbers, symbols, or two-letter codes that looked like ciphers. I flipped to a section in the middle marked with a tab fashioned from a hair tie. The top of the page was labeled, "Where Music Goes to Sleep." Beneath it was a floor plan, crude, hand-drawn, but detailed. The rooms were labeled in her shaky handwriting: main lounge, spiral stair, west alcove, velvet hall, but it was the eastern wing that held my attention. There, behind what appeared to be a linen closet on the drawing, was a small rectangle marked with an arrow. Hidden door, storage elevator, goes down further than it should. Right beside it, circled 3 times, were the words, "Where Music Goes to Sleep." I marked the page with a slip and moved on. The next one sent a chill down my spine. Guests who didn't come back. 8 sets of initials, no full names, no dates, just letters, scattered in 2 columns with the numbers 1 through 8 beside them. Some of the handwriting looked rushed, others were traced over again and again until the paper wrinkled. Below the list was a single sentence: "The pool was drained that night," but no one said why. I flagged the entry and turned the page. A sketch followed, rough, almost childlike, but unmistakably detailed. It depicted a tall, slouched man in an elaborate chair, the high back stretching above his head like thorns. Around him were men in masks. They weren't party masks. These were something else. Long, featureless, curved like the beaks of old plague doctors, except without the eye holes. Each man wore gloves. Each stood in the same exact posture, hands folded in front. Waiting. In the lower left corner, the girl had written, "They only laughed when I cried." I closed the book and stared at the wall for a moment. The edges of the sketch burned behind my eyelids. Then I called the profile. He arrived 2 hours later, a tall man with a file-thin voice and gloves of his own. He asked no questions before opening the journal, just turned pages, pausing every so often to scan a line, blink once, and keep going. After 25 minutes he spoke. "None of this reads like fantasy." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean the inconsistency, the layering, the repetition of stress markers, the emotional shifts. A child inventing trauma doesn't create coded redundancy, they create spectacle. This is someone documenting real fragments, probably dissociative in nature, possibly instructed. Either way, these aren't fictions, they're anchors." He pointed to one of the entries in the back, a small corner note dated with only a month and year, March 2015. The text read, "They took her because she cried too loud. I told them it was my fault. They said maybe I'd go next time. I hid the hair tie in my sock. I still have it. Her name was S. She smelled like oranges and always tapped her foot to the music when it played. She didn't scream when the door shut. She just stopped being there." The profiler looked at me. "S, you see the rest of the initials here?" I nodded. "Yeah." He didn't say anything else, just handed me a printed database sheet I hadn't seen before. A missing person report, pulled from a regional list of unresolved cases between 2014 and 2017. One entry highlighted in yellow. Name, Selena J.C. Age, 14. Last seen, March 2015. Reported missing from Juvenile Outreach Center. No official family contact listed. Status, case unresolved, believed runaway. The initials matched, the date matched, and the detail that gutted me. She'd been wearing a pink hair tie when last seen. That was the same one used to tab the page. I opened the journal again, lifted the makeshift tab, and there it was. Pink and faded, strands of fabric fraying at the edge. This wasn't just a diary. It was a ledger of loss. I locked the journal in evidence storage that night, but I didn't sleep. Not really. I kept seeing the sketch of the masked men, the entry about the pool, the phrase where music goes to sleep. I kept asking myself what kind of place needs that many rooms beneath its floorboards, and what kind of silence demands that a child remember this much horror and still call it life. And as I pulled up the estate blueprint one more time, cross-referencing her map with the city's official layout, I found the space, a blank, unregistered void beneath the east wing, unaccounted for in every permit. Just a dead zone, but she knew it was there. She always knew. Chapter 7. They called her a ghost. I submit this affidavit under the condition of complete anonymity. I am no longer employed in private security. I've relocated, changed my name, and severed all ties to the individuals and properties mentioned below. If this reaches court, it must be read into sealed record. I will not testify in person. I've seen what happens to those who try. I was employed by the estate, yes, that one, from 2012 to 2016. My contract was under a subcontractor that no longer exists. On paper, though, I suspect the people behind it still operate under a new name. The job was sold to me as executive residential security. High profile but routine. Keep out the press, keep guests where they belong, keep the camera feeds clean. We were not bodyguards, we were filters. The property itself was a compound more than a home, 3 stories above ground, but more levels below than we were ever allowed to see. My clearance covered the west wing, the external perimeter, and specific entry zones during scheduled events. The rest was segmented, locked, not just with keys or codes, but with eyes. If you looked too long at the wrong hallway, someone noticed, you'd get reassigned, or worse, your badge would deactivate mid-shift, and you'd be told your contract had expired. That happened to a guy named Lewis. He asked too many questions about a room behind the theater. We never saw him again. And then there was the girl. We weren't supposed to see her, ever. But we knew she existed because she left traces. Empty trays, scratched wallpaper, music drifting from behind closed doors, and once in a while, only during certain events, we'd catch glimpses. A flicker of movement down a back stairwell, the sound of a cassette clicking shut. She always carried that thing, an old cassette player with headphones, taped in places like it had been repaired 100 times over. She'd walk the back corridors during closed hours, usually barefoot, always alone. The staff called her Ghost. Not out of cruelty, it was just what she became to us. Something always there but never meant to be acknowledged. I once asked a floor manager who she was. He said she was a case of adoption gone wrong and told me not to mention her again. But there was one night I won't forget. It was during one of the red events. That's what we called them unofficially. You know the type. Lights dimmed, special guests only, NDA-level entertainment. We were told not to patrol past the Velvet Hall that night unless ordered, but I'd been rotated to check the HVAC integrity on the lower level because a guest had complained about the temperature. I went down the East Wing service corridor, and that's where I saw her. She was standing just outside a storage door, completely still, like she was waiting for someone. Red paint on her hands, not smeared but deliberate, both palms completely coated. She was crying, but not sobbing. Silent tears. Her eyes were fixed on the wall across from her, like she was trying to remember something she wasn't allowed to forget. She didn't see me, or if she did, she didn't care. I stood there, half hidden by a maintenance pillar, for maybe 15 seconds. Then a chime rang out. 3 soft tones. I'd only heard it once before, years earlier. When that tone played, doors locked and the lighting in the East Wing would shift to emergency red for exactly 7 minutes. I moved back. Fast. I didn't want to be seen, and when I turned around again, she was gone. The next morning, I checked the footage. Nothing. Not even static. just 7 full minutes of missing feed, cameras disabled, logs erased. That's when I started keeping my own notes. I won't detail everything I saw, not here, but I will say this. There were rooms in that estate that don't exist on the official blueprints, soundproofed, lined with something that looked like foam but wasn't. I once opened a closet to find a narrow passage behind it, leading down into a concrete stairwell that wasn't wired for light. I only took 2 steps before the air changed, thick, metallic, like breathing in the inside of a sealed container. After certain events, contracted cleaners would arrive, not janitors, not catering staff, men with gloves and silver hard cases. We weren't allowed to speak to them. Once I saw them carry out a locked metal crate. It was the size of a dog kennel, heavy. They lifted it into an unmarked van and drove off before the sun rose. I don't know what was inside, but I remember how quiet it was, as if the crate itself was holding its breath. I left 6 months after that. I told them I was relocating. They didn't ask questions, just cleared my badge and erased my housing access code. I moved, changed my name, tried to forget, but I couldn't. Not after what I saw. Years later, I saw a blurred image on the news, a courtroom sketch, a girl with downcast eyes holding a cassette player. I knew it was her. So here it is, the only thing I can offer now. Inside the estate, behind the wine cellar on the Lower East Wing, there's a false wall. Not visible unless you know what to press. Behind that wall, last I knew, was a film reel, not digital, actual film, labeled only with a red marker. Guest study C, playback denied. If she's telling the truth, and I believe she is, then that reel is the proof you're looking for. I'm not coming forward after this. I've said what I can. But you need to check the wall. The affidavit ended there. No name, no signature, just a digital chain of verification that confirmed it came through the private submission channel reserved for high-risk witnesses. 2 days later, investigators entered the estate. After consulting the daughter's journal and mapping the old stairwell, they reached the wine cellar. They tapped against the brick panel behind the second shelf and heard the hollow echo. They pried it open, and there it was. A single film reel, dust-covered, labeled in red. They've just started watching it. Chapter 8. A face she doesn't recognize. The room they gave me in the courthouse safe house isn't much. Beige walls, a small desk, bed with stiff sheets, a window that doesn't open, only looks out over a courtyard where no one ever stands. Everything in here is quiet. Too quiet, but not like it used to be. This silence isn't the kind that presses its hands over your mouth. It's the kind that waits for you to speak, like it finally has time to listen. It's been 4 days since I testified. I haven't turned on the television or asked for updates. I know they're talking about it somewhere, in rooms I'll never enter, behind doors with locks thicker than any I knew in that house. I imagine my name, no, not even that, my pseudonym, floating in someone's report. A bullet point in a briefing, a code, a case. They still call me Cora here, that name they gave me before the hearing. It's not mine, but I answer to it. It's easier that way, safer, less confusing when someone knocks on the door to deliver food or ask if I'm sleeping enough. I always say yes. I'm not, but I say it anyway. The truth is, I don't really know who I am, not just because of what happened. That confusion started years ago. When you grow up in a place where no one says your name out loud, you start to become something that only exists in reflections, in window glass, in camera feeds you're not supposed to notice. There was a mirror in my old room. It was nailed to the wall. I wasn't allowed to touch it. One time I tried, and the housekeeper, maybe the 4th one, maybe the 5th, I can't remember her name, she slapped my hand and said, "That's not for you." I thought she meant the mirror, but later I realized she meant the reflection. I don't think I was made to be a person. I think I was made to be a contingency, a secret kept in case another one needed replacing. like a spare key hidden under the porch, not loved, just stored. Sometimes I wonder if he ever looked at me and saw anything besides a shadow of someone else, a failed project, a quiet solution. I used to ask the walls that question. I'd whisper it at night, hoping someone on the other side of the vents would answer. They never did. Today, something changed. A female guard, she's the only one who talks to me without sounding like she's reading from a script, knocked twice and came in with a manila envelope. No return address, no signature, just slid under the door with my breakfast. I waited until she left, then opened it. Inside was a photograph, faded, almost sun-washed, from the 90s. A woman sitting on the edge of a sofa, hair tied back, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. Not posed, just caught in a moment. You can tell by the way she's looking at the baby, like she's guarding something sacred. I didn't recognize her. She wasn't one of the nannies, wasn't any of the women I ever saw at the house. But there was something about the way she held the child, the bend of her arm, the way her hand cradled the back of the baby's head, like she was trying to shield it from the camera. The baby had a cassette player sitting beside its foot, the same kind I carried all those years. On the back of the photo, written in ink that had started to bleed through the paper, were the words, "She kept you safe until they found out." There was a second slip of paper inside, smaller, folded 3 times. It simply said, "There are others." I held that photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I just felt pulled, like I was staring into something that had always been just out of reach, something my memories had been trying to point toward without giving me the full image. That woman, whoever she is, she knew. She saw me before I was erased, before I became Ghost, before I became Cora. I walked over to the window then. The glass is too clean. I can see myself clearly, and I hate that. The longer I stare, the more I feel like the edges of my face blur, not because I don't know who I am, but because I don't recognize the person I was made into. I touched the reflection just for a second and whispered, "I don't even know whose face this is anymore." The guard came back an hour later. She didn't knock this time, just opened the door, stepped inside, and looked at me the way someone does when they're holding back too much at once. "They're reopening the entire case," she said quietly. "Not just yours, all of it." I didn't say anything, I just nodded. She paused in the doorway before leaving. "Whatever they tried to bury, it's surfacing. You started something." I thought about that as the door closed behind her. The phrase didn't feel triumphant. It felt like the sound of earth cracking after a drought. Necessary, inevitable, and loud. He used to control the silence. Now it's louder than he's ever been.